For Reasons Wretched and Divine by Freya Ryder 24. Reading Part 1. There was a seismic shift somewhere, everywhere, that night, as everything went back to normal. The bookshop and the Bentley were restored. Neither of them burnt beyond repair. The M25 had lost any trace of fire, too, as had all those who were on it when it happened. Those who had been lost were found, and those who were no more were back. With the lack of any sort of evidence, when they woke up that morning, most people put anything odd they'd seen over the past few days down to a particularly bad and strange dream. Those who spoke about it, in person and online, eventually put it down to a mass hallucination, or a false memory, or a weird crossover with a dreamlike parallel universe. It must have been some sort of weird tangible version of the Mandela effect, or the Berenstain effect. A strange misremembering that united so many people, and yet couldn't possibly have happened. But there were aftershocks. The following evening, a nightingale found its way into central London, and finally sang in Berkeley Square. Earlier that afternoon, a sapling had withered quite suddenly into a brittle twig, in perhaps the last case of that kind of quasi-magical occurrence in Tadfield. Elsewhere, things looked shinier than they had before, or cleaner. Rivers that were being dredged for rubbish brought up less than expected. An oil spill was found to have done less damage than feared, and was contained faster than anticipated. Landfill sites somehow seemed emptier, or bigger, like perhaps some of the rubbish had been spirited away. Researchers found new, unrecorded pods of whales, coalitions of cheetahs, crashes of rhinos, bands of gorillas. Leaders of countries at war, or at odds, woke up with just a little bit more peace in their hearts. A little bit more hopefulness. Crops in countries with starving populations seemed to be yielding more food than projected. Things were just a little bit better than they had been before. There were other shifts, though, of a different origin to that first, unrelated to those aftershocks, because God does not play dice with the universe. She plays an ineffable game, and sometimes, rarely, that necessitates interventions. The two of them didn't notice it happen, not really. They knew the world felt different, somehow, but they couldn't pinpoint what. They put it down to a lingering sensation from all that had happened, but at some point along the way, they realized it wasn't leaving. Something had changed, something deep. Deeper than even the Antichrist ceasing to be so, and dissolving Armageddon. Something personal, somehow. Curly was the one who first said something. Aziraphale had been putting it down to unease about being at conflict with heaven. But Crowley had been used to the discomfort of rebellion for a very, very long time. "Angel," he said one evening, several months after the apocalypse that wasn't. Aziraphale finished reading the sentence he was on before looking up. "Do you feel, different, somehow?" Aziraphale slowly closed the book in his hand. "Different? How?" "I don't know, I don't." Crowley shook his head, then stood up from the sofa on the back of the bookshop to pace, trying to identify exactly what he was trying to say. Aziraphale watched him as he meandered around the space, weaving between shelves and stacks of books. Everything looked the same here, he thought, as it had done several years ago, or 11 years ago now, that night when Crowley had convinced him to share godparenting duties over Warlock. Well, almost the same. Aziraphale had gone over every book in the shop in the weeks following the events of Tadfield. And although several new collections of children's books had appeared, including one he suspected Adam Young have authorized himself, nothing of any serious value, sentimental or otherwise, had vanished, except for some of the wine he kept in the back room, which had been turned into bottles of a rather sweet kind of grape juice. Everything was as it was. Yet things had changed. Things had changed across the universe, for a start. Things had changed between heaven and hell. Aziraphale was trying not to think too hard about the philosophical implications of what he said to the airbase, and he was pretty sure Gabriel and the others were doing the same. And other things had changed too. Things between him and Crowley. Things he hadn't quite labeled yet. But they were definitely moving in a more forward direction than they had been before. That was what Aziraphale was thinking about when Crowley mentioned things felt different. Eventually Crowley came and sat down on a chair again, the one at Aziraphale's desk, and had moved it so that they were face to face, less than a meter between them. The angular yet snake-like body leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his pensive gold eyes meeting Aziraphale's gentle pale ones. Crowley rarely wore his sunglasses at home anymore. By home, of course, he meant the bookshop, or anywhere Aziraphale was around, and they were otherwise alone. Right now they were discarded on a side table, somewhere on the other side of the shop, and so Aziraphale was free to look directly into those beautiful glint irises. Do you feel like something's changed? Inside, like, maybe in relation to heaven? Aziraphale dragged his attention away from Crowley's eyes and focused on his words instead. In relation to heaven? What on earth do you mean? Crowley threw himself back in the chair and looked towards the ceiling. I don't know how to explain it. It feels like there's something missing, or different, or something in relation to hell. Like maybe there's a connection that's gone, somehow. Aziraphale reached over to the table beside him and put his book down, taking his glasses off and folding them neatly on top of it. Crowley swung his head back down into his chest and watched him. There was a precision in what he was doing that Crowley knew he meant he was about to say something that he was still coming up with the words to properly articulate. He waited. Well, I have been feeling off, since it happened. But I rather assumed it was just nerves, just the after effects of... He made some sort of vague gesture with his hands. Defying heaven. Aziraphale had been careful not to say defying God, or anything to that effect, partly because he was hopeful that he hadn't, and partly because he was making an active effort to try to put some distance between the concepts of God and heaven in his mind. Something told him that perhaps God was really more of a neutral party, one aligned with neither heaven nor hell, and possibly not with earth either. It might as well be, Crowley mused, still for a moment. Or... He leapt to his feet again and resumed pacing around the small area in the back of the shop. Aziraphale watched with interest, at the same time trying to feel for what it was that Crowley had suggested was missing. Had he felt a tangible link to heaven before? There must have been one. That's where his miracles came from, after all. But could he feel it? Or... Crowley continued, nodding as his mind made sense of everything. Perhaps we've been cut off. Cut off? Aziraphale gasped. He frowned, crinkles appearing and a scattering across his face as Crowley watched. But my dear fellow, they couldn't possibly have. How? I don't know. Crowley's eyes had taken on a hint of devilish mischief that made Aziraphale nervous and thrilled in equal measure. But we're not really of either of them, now are we? You are not really of heaven, and I'm not really of hell. We're on our own side. Maybe that's real now. Our own side? Yeah, like... He searched for the right word, the right combination of meanings. Helven, Hevel, Aziraphale, Crowlafel, and Aziraphale-Crowley combo, Earthside, neither heaven nor hell. They sat in silence for a while, each pondering this new possibility. How do we know? It was Aziraphale who broke the silence, and Crowley conceded it was a valid question. A vague feeling wasn't exactly confirmation. No idea, he had to eventually admit. We could ask. Ask, Crowley scoffed. Ask who, Angel? A tentative finger pointed towards the ceiling. Her. Crowley was taken aback. Aziraphale had told him about the failed attempt to speak to God, the dismissive response from the Metatron. How was he expecting that route to go now that he'd been officially cast out? Not through the official channels, Aziraphale clarified, letting the words tumble out as he thought of them, not quite sure where he was going with this line of thought. Not using the circle, I mean, just praying, directly to God. She might not respond, of course, she hardly ever does, especially these days. But perhaps she might, I don't know, send us a sign? He looked up and saw the skepticism on Crowley's face. Oh, no, you're right, my dear, of course. I just wondered... He took a steady breath. I just hoped that maybe she'd make an exception. That if this, he gestured generally at the bookshop, at the two of them, is all part of the ineffable plan, then perhaps she would talk to us, if we tried. In one swift, fluid motion, Crowley stepped over to Aziraphale's sofa and folded himself down onto it, curling up into a comforting knot next to his angel, and reaching out to place a supportive hand on the other's. We can try, he said gently, soothingly. I don't think she'll listen to me. I've tried before, but she might answer to you. It's always worth a try. You tried before? Aziraphale's voice was small and fragile, perilously close to sounding like he was crying. but he'd picked up on the detail Crowley hadn't quite meant to share, and the demon had to restrain himself from cursing under his breath. Yeah, I did. Curly's eyes didn't meet Aziraphale's, instead focusing just a little too fiercely on the small circles of motion his thumb was making at the back of Aziraphale's hand. When I was trying to figure out where we should go. Alpha Centauri. I asked her why she was doing this, why she was allowing heaven and hell to test humans to destruction. She didn't answer. She didn't answer. She would never answer. Not to Crowley's questions. He'd learned that a long time ago, when his questions had sent him plummeting and burning in knowing that he could never be forgiven for that simple, innocent act. Perhaps she did. Crowley looked up to see Aziraphale's eyes far off, glazed over as if looking at nothing. Perhaps she did, and you didn't realize. It seems she has a habit, you see, of letting people prove the answer themselves, rather than just giving it to them in as many words. Aziraphale seemed to be gaining momentum now, a new strength coming back into his voice. Some humans believe that's why they don't hear the Almighty anymore, because they stopped learning how to listen. You asked why she was allowing this to happen, and then you set your mind to stopping it, and she let it not happen. She let you make your own decision on it, and that gave you your answer. She wasn't allowing it to happen. You were part of the reason it didn't. Sounds like a bit of a cop-out to me. Aziraphale hummed. Well, that may be, but it stands to reason that if we ask and don't get a verbal response, we might still be able to find out the answer, and the mere act of asking might drive us to it. Crowley shrugged. As I said, worth a try. A silence settled over the two of them again. The occasional sounds of late-night London traffic drifted in from outside, a soft background noise to the sound of their breathing and their beating hearts. End of Part 1 reading.